them is Taiwan. Late this week, Taiwan had recorded 252 cases and only 2 deaths, a much lower percentage than its larger East Asian neighbors. Taipei says it alerted the WHO at the end of December about the risk of human-to-human transmission of COVID-19, but concerns were not passed on. Despite being shut out by China and the WHO, Taiwan's efforts in combating the outbreak were recognized by the European Union in a recent video conference.
Would the WHO consider Taiwan's membership? Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
We decided to give Dr. Alward another call to follow up.
And I just want to see if you can comment a bit on how Taiwan has done so far in terms of containing the virus.
Well, we've already talked about China, and when you look across all the different areas of China, they've actually all done quite a good job. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting us to participate, and good luck as you go forward with the battle in Hong Kong.
So that was the first time I saw that video. I actually thought it was like a poorly edited video. I thought it was like, someone just making something kind of funny. It seemed almost jarring how awkward that was. And, this situation is kind of, with the COVID-19 pandemic sweeping the world, there's really a big question as to, why Taiwan, being the front line of this pandemic, is being sidelined. There's a lot of things that Taiwan is doing. It's even despite it's only 23 million people, but it's kept its infection rate very, very low and very, very little local cases. Many of them are actually cases that came from outside of Taiwan itself. Today we're going to talk about the kind of part one in terms of the international scene as to where Taiwan is right now. Originally we're going to do a part two to kind of talk about kind of like the internal, how Taiwan got its democracy. But in terms of time, we're going to cut these to 2 different sections. First, we're going to talk about internationally. So there's a big question of, how did Taiwan become international, like where it is right now internationally? And, more importantly, why does it matter? If we're really looking at these 2 situations, we really have to understand 2 main events that happened, and it's the Chinese Civil War and the United Nations expulsion of the Republic of China. And the Chinese Civil War essentially sets the stage for the expulsion of the ROC, or, quote unquote, Taiwan. And get into a little bit detail as to why there is this quote unquote. So putting that into perspective, ROC, Republic of China, and Taiwan are actually 2 different things. In the international stage, there really is no Taiwan per se. Taiwan itself is an island, is a location, but Taiwan's never actually had its own government. In the past, it's had European colonization in terms of putting it as a trading post. It was part of the Qing dynasty. It was colonized by the Japanese, and currently it's by the Republic of China government. Sometimes it's really hard because nowadays we keep them as kind of equal terms. We wanted to, in order to kind of understand the differences between these 2, we're going to take an example of World War II, for example. Take an example of World War II. During World War II, Republic of China, or ROC, was fighting within China, representing China, and they fought in the Allied forces. Whereas Taiwan was part of the Japanese Empire, so they actually fought on the Axis power. So essentially, Taiwan kind of was on the losing side there. Moving forward, there's going to be a clear distinction between Taiwan and ROC. There's a lot of it. We're going to talk about where ROC is as a government and its international recognition, and why there's going to be a portion of this talking more about China and Chinese Civil War. And just a reminder to everyone, if there are any questions coming up, say from Upper West Side, New York, or Toronto, there's a link in the chat, and also on top of these slides. Make sure to do the capitalizations to kind of ask any questions during the thing or after the thing. We can touch upon that as you want, and feel free to drop in a message here and there. So talk about the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War, kind of putting things into perspective, there's two wars that we'd actually have to talk about: the Chinese Civil War and World War II, or China actually called it the Second Sino-Japanese War. The first Sino-Japanese War was when Taiwan was handed over to Japan, But in the beginning of 1927, the Republic of China, led by General Chiang Kai-shek, represented with the white sun, blue sky, red earth, what you kind of see now as like the quote-unquote the Taiwan flag, has been fighting the CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, and is represented by the hammer and sickle. You might kind of wonder, we're talking about like communist China. Why aren't we using why isn't the more commonly seen 5-star flag being used? The 5-star flag represents the country of People's Republic of China. At this time, they did not exist yet. It was purely just the Chinese Communist Party. So, the war between the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the ROC, with the Communist Party started in 1927. It wasn't until 1931 where Japanese started attacking and started their aggression on northeast China. But then in 1936, as the Chinese Civil War was raging on, but by 1936, General Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Army were actually having CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, on the ropes. They were, they're surrounding them, they're dwindling in numbers, but the Chiang Kai-shek's own subordinates actually placed him on house arrest, and got him to focus on attacking the Japanese rather than the Chinese Communist Party. So by 1937, General Chiang Kai-shek formally announced their war with Japanese. Following suit in the CCP area, Chairman Mao also proclaimed that CCP was going to join Greater China to fight this common enemy of Japan. While the CCP army did join forces with the ROC, a lot of them changed their uniforms, their hats, their emblems and everything, they actually were still underneath the CCP command. And as time goes on, we figured that they actually grew by their numbers during World War II. Then in 1945, after 2 atomic bombs were dropped in Japan, the Japanese Empire offered their surrender to the Allied forces. In the West, there were celebrations about the end of the war, but in China, there was still some unresolved business as to representation of all of China. So, with the war ending, no more common enemy, the quote-unquote truce between these two parties, they still fought here and there during the time, they no longer existed. So, during World War II, the CCP actually amassed a large army, whereas a lot of ROC, they were losing their army due to the World War II casualties. By 1945, at the end of World War II, Chiang Kai-shek invited Chairman Mao to come to Chongqing to discuss a truce, to see let's promote peace for the Greater China. The two shared dinner. It was very pompous. It was really, really big, and it was really nice. But at the same time, it was really nice. And then even at the end of it, Mao actually raised his glass and was shouting, "Long live Chairman Chiang." But this was all really a publicity stunt. Both of them wanted to appeal to the masses as the people that wanted peace, that wasn't trying to keep the war fighting. But by 1946, the Republic of China essentially decided to formally take on the CCP once again. With superior firepower supplied by the United States, they beat on the CCP. However, in 1947, though, PRC started taking reinforcements from Soviet Russia and was able to match. Not just that, because of the war, Chiang Kai-shek actually ravaged a lot of the countryside, whereas CCP, they actually started gathering a lot of the farmers along the side, get them on their places, kind of give them a lot of land, get them better living, and appeal to the masses. And it wasn't until, kind of going back into, sorry, I missed a little bit on the slide, but at the end, by 1949, there was even negotiations. 6 negotiators were sent over to the Chinese Communist Party to see if there was a peace treaty that could be done. The kind of deals that they wanted to do originally was kind of visibly seen in this map, whereas they want to say, hey, northern China, it'll belong to the Chinese Communist Party, whereas the southern China will belong, along with Taiwan, would belong to the Nationalist Party or the Republic of China. But as time went on, the Chiang Kai-shek army lost much of their ground and even more of their supporters. Even more so was probably the 6 original negotiators that were sent to negotiate terms actually defected to the CCP. This is a huge loss of morale, and Chiang Kai-shek couldn't take it anymore. The negotiations came back saying, the Nationalist Army, Chiang Kai-shek had to be arrested, they had to give up their constitution, and essentially destroy their entire party and country. And so he turned it down, and eventually became eventually with the war raging on, the Chinese Communist Party won won the Chinese Civil War, or quote unquote won the Chinese Civil War, and drove Republic of China out of China and into Taiwan. PRC set up their capital in Beijing and declared their victory. But when we talk about war, a question that I want to pose to everyone watching is, when did the Chinese Civil War really end, or actually did it actually end? A lot of times people talk about it. People talk about 1949 being the end of the Chinese Civil War, and this is when the CCP, or the PRC, People's Republic of China, was created, established in Beijing. But how does a war really end? We can take World War II as an example of how World War II ended, and also get a little bit of idea of how Taiwan ended. So by the end of World War II, there was, after Japanese surrender, it was like, oh, we surrendered. There was no formal treaty yet. So there was an official General Order Number 1 that was sent down saying that a lot of the land that Japan took, including Taiwan, was to be surrendered to General Chiang Kai-shek. The war, I guess, kind of officially ends when the losing side and the winning side get together and have a peace treaty to see, like, what are the terms of surrender, what things are given up, how provisions are made. For example, for World War II, the San Francisco Treaty was signed, essentially saying things like Japan could not have an army; they can only have a self-defense force. Part of it was also saying that Japan surrenders Formosa, which is Taiwan, Formosa, and the Pescadores. And so these kind of treaties are actually the definitions of how a war formally ends, because there needs to be proper terms. Then going from after the Chiang Kai-shek's retreat in 1949 to Taiwan, and starting from 1950 to 1970, there was a huge change in terms of the things that was going on in both sides. People in China went through the Cultural Revolution, whereas the people in Taiwan from 1950s to 1970s were experiencing the White Terror and martial law. Both were going through a lot, but in China, the PRC kind of focused on governing and getting the people of China into a better life. They had great leaps, quote unquote, the great leap forward, but there was also a lot of bad choices that were made that caused a lot of people to starve. So there were ups and downs, but for the most part, they were governing China. Taiwan, on the other hand, was a bit different. With Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Nationalist Party still aiming to reclaim China, they enforced martial law that essentially put the power in the army, in the military, in Chiang Kai-shek, and using war efforts as a way to quell any discords within the island. No freedom to gather, to read and distribute certain books. Certain music were even banned. I think there was this one song about, this sad person and drinking alcohol. And that was banned because it was promoting an unhealthy living, such as drinking alcohol. And a lot of these were punished by death. And probably one of the worst things was this idea that everyone had to report these communist spies. This resembles a little bit like the Red Scare that was happening in America at around the same time, where people were reporting on each other saying that person's a communist, that person's a communist. As long as you were suspected of being communist, you were arrested, and a lot of people were also executed. Anyone who were talking about, points of freedom or Taiwanese independence, even during this time, a lot of times were executed or blacklisted. So during this time, thanks to the Cold War and really the fear of communism, United States also was getting a lot of industries to move to Taiwan, especially after the fall of Japan, and also a lot of money was being invested in here. This paved the road to, Taiwan's golden eras, a lot of things being made in Taiwan, that kind of paved the road for that. Then also during this time, part of Cold War is also the two major wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and again this really centered around communism. And these two major wars, Korean War is actually a quite interesting one. There was some declassified CIA documents, I think, saying about intelligence gathering from China, essentially from China and Russia, where Russia was deciding where to put their money in, whether to help the North Korea take over all Korea Peninsula or help China take over the rest of the Nationalist Army War, which is essentially Taiwan. They decided to go with Korea, thinking that was going to be a quick, easy war, but it wasn't so, and kind of delayed and ultimately never gave the chance for China to try to fully take over Taiwan. But just like how World War II propelled the United States to become the world's dominant power, China, by engaging in these wars, started bolstering its army, and more importantly, probably having a common enemy of, say, capitalism and America. The Chinese people kind of united together to fight against this Western evil power. And so, in the meantime, though, in Taiwan, ROC was acting almost like a supply depot or resting stop for a lot of these U.S. troops. For example, just fun fact, I went to the Taipei American School, which was set up in the 50s, and the 1950 actually, and it was actually meant for school for a lot of these soldiers and their kids. So Taiwan became a resting stop and didn't really as actively participate in these wars. Not only that, culturally speaking, the people in Taiwan, instead of having just one common enemy such as capitalism or America, there was actually a split between the Han Taiwanese and the Chinese Taiwanese. And remember, a lot of times during these times there was martial law. A lot of money was taken from the local industries, the businesses in the area, and pumped into the war efforts in China. See, we have another person joining from Paris. Anyone who's joining us, we just kind of went through a little bit about the Chinese Civil War. This really does set the scene for the United Nations resolution that eventually de-recognized Republic of China. If there are any questions, please feel free, click on the link above, ask any questions, and we can deal with them. Or if any questions you have about Taiwan or its representation in the world. As time went on, Communist China, PRC, their power grew, and they also had a lot of foreign diplomacy that was going on. So eventually that had more and more people. I realize my stream is covering the name. They had more and more people, more and more countries recognizing PRC as a representative of China instead of ROC. And so by 1970, more and more nations, a lot of these nations started joining the United Nations, and there was finally a situation where there's a possibility for the PRC to replace ROC as representatives of China. And so just like any proceedings, any motions that are put in from the United Nations, there is a debate that ensues, and people pushing for and against this motion. The leading country, the country that was leading the charge to keep ROC in the United Nations was United States. We're going to see a clip here from then UN ambassador from the United States, George Bush Sr., actually speaking to the assembly.
Let it take the constructive road, that which assures equal rights is between large and small, not the ancient, discredited, and utterly sinister road that leads to the role of the strong over the weak. And let this decision, fellow delegates, be made not in Taipei, let it be made not in Peking, but here in New York. Let it be made not according to the demands of either party, but according to the interests and the spirit of the United Nations. And having made our decision in that spirit, then we can in good conscience say to both parties, the halls of the United Nations are big enough for you both. The doors of the United Nations are open to you both for the urgent and creative work of building a more peaceful world. Thank you, Mr. President.
So that was then UN Ambassador George Bush Sr., and the United States really had many approaches. Their main idea was to keep ROC in the United Nations, and they had two main tactics of going about this. The first one was putting this motion of PRC. So the overall motion was to have PRC represent China and remove ROC from the assembly itself. And so the first tactic was to put this entire motion as an important issue. In the United Nations, for an important issue to pass, there needed to be a 2/3 majority, as opposed to a typical motion where there is just over half majority required. This didn't pass. Then the second tactic that United States tried to lead was splitting the motion to two different parts. First, voting on the admission of PRC, then voting on the expulsion of ROC. They kind of assumed that the first part of admitting PRC was going to pass, and hoping that the second part either wouldn't pass or potentially just never really happen. And kind of the response that was happening in Taiwan for Republic of China's president, Chiang Kai-shek, he, for the longest time, during the entire time of fighting the communists from 1920s all the way until 1970, Chiang Kai-shek has been saying, "汉贼不两立," which means Chinese and scoundrels will never coexist. And so because of this and kind of partially kind of faced, he didn't want to allow for two Chinas. Like, we can't coexist. You can only take one of us. For the most part, this was kind of a thing that he's been saying for decades. And if he ever went back on it, it just wouldn't look good. There's kind of a publicity, kind of a face side. Towards the end, though, Chiang Kai-shek, there were some memos that was being published that Chiang Kai-shek started being able to kind of tolerate this idea of two China. And he's like, don't seek support for it, but if you must, I guess we can do two China. And this two China policy is kind of sets the space for, nowadays you hear a lot of this people talking about like the one China policy. And I think a large part of it came from this idea of like, okay, how are we going to do it? The one China or the two China kind of thing. And so this kind of led to this kind of discussion and China's push for it. Then, as these votings were going down, the ROC representatives, let's just say they were not happy.
3.2 is a flagrant violation of the Charter governing the expulsion of member states. In view of the frenzy and the irrational manners that has been exhibited in this hall, the delegation of the Republic of China has now decided not to take part to any further proceedings of this General Assembly.
So that was then Minister of Foreign Affairs Zhou Sukai, who took to the podium and expressed his discontent with how things were going. And with him, as you can see here, the rest of the ROC delegates left the hall. This was pretty much the last time that the ROC was ever represented in these, United Nations hallways. The departure of the ROC from the United Nations now means the door to PRC is open, and PRC also takes on the ROC's permanent seat on the Security Council. So just in case there's any questions about the United Nations, it was founded by the individual allied powers. They have permanent seats on the Security Council, which means they have this, they're never voted off. They're always on the Security Council, and they also have this full veto power as well too. So as you know, right now, China or PRC actually holds a large power of the United Nations. So there's a question that is being presented here, a question asked by an audience right now, saying, if the United Nations resolution was to transfer authority of China to ROC has passed, did the United Nations actually have the authority to enforce it? So this is the UN resolution. This is talking about which governments have the right to represent each individual state. Actually, I had one of these slides, but I decided to skip it. But if you go on the United Nations, the charter talking about, who gets, how does a state or government get recognized by the United Nations or, a government? United Nations says we're actually a group of states. We can't recognize individual governments. We can only recognize individual states. So with that idea, it's kind of weird, but essentially they're saying like we recognize China, but we're recognizing these people as the authorities of it. So it's kind of like a club thing. Like think of it almost like if there was a coalition of organizations. I'm the parent organization, and there's 5 small organizations. One of them splits off. I want to, there's 2 presidents or whatever. I can kind of still get to pick which one represents it. Essentially it was enforced, and a large part of it is by majority majority votes. So it's a good question, but this has been upheld. Actually, the reason why this actually doesn't really matter is because right when the speech that was delivered, right here, and I'm gonna mute the sound. This speech right here is actually done before the voting was even completed. So they were so mad. They were like, no, we're done with this. And so There was another video also in the AP archives talking about how, this is official words from the government saying, it's to be noted that we didn't get kicked out, we left. Like, we decided to leave because this was so outrageous. It was kind of supposed to be this kind of mic drop moment, be like, no, I didn't get fired, I quit. The reception is a little bit different. So even if UN didn't have the authority to enforce it, they quit themselves. So that is a weird part. So then this question really comes around, it's a really interesting thought exercise, I guess, is, what if the ROC government did accept the two Chinas? This is something that could be thought about. Taiwan, Republic of China at this time, would have some sort of representation. And sometimes you might be thinking like, well, what do you mean by two China? How can one country be represented by two different governments? And to that, I say there is actually already an existing situation. So, like, for example, Korea has two representations in United Nations. Both North and South Korea are represented in the United Nations, and technically, the Korean War has never ended. They're currently in a ceasefire, but they're technically still at war. That's why a lot of South Korean men are drafted. They have to go into the army, and also why they're constantly at war. There's the DMZ zone and everything. So it's still there. And really the big question, as we talk about all of this, there's a question of, why does this even matter? And, the idea behind the topic today really comes from the COVID-19 pandemic. So WHO or WHA, the World Health Organization or World Health Assembly, is a subsidiary organization underneath the United Nations. So any organization that is... I just realized that the video played with no sound, so I apologize for that. But essentially, that was about Korea getting double representation. Talking about WHO, WHA, essentially, these are subsidiary organizations underneath the United Nations. Any state that's in the UN can join the WHO and hence the WHA. Taiwan, or Republic ROC, because it is not in the United Nations, is denied access to all these international organizations. WHO, there's other organizations such as ICAO, which is the civil aviation organization. All these meetings are missing Taiwan. And you might say, well, Taiwan's 23 million people, it's a small island, it should be fine. But as you can see from the situations, even the past couple of days, this is actually quite a big problem. So Taiwan, for the COVID-19, started in China in the Wuhan region. Taiwan heard wind of this at the end of December. Like right when it happened, they kind of knew that there was something wrong going on over there. So they sent an email to WHO saying, hey, we think there's human-to-human transmission now. And now WHO, this literally is a report I think that came out last night or today, talking about that they're spatting about technicalities or whether the information was given or not. Someone said there was an email sent, someone said no, you didn't say it, and it's a weird thing that goes back and forth. I look at this, and this is really why Taiwan's representation in the international organizations matter a lot, because there's an easy way, as anyone who's in work or communicating with anyone, emails are great, but what's even better is in person to talk. If Taiwan was in WHO at this time, they could have easily risen this kind of situation to talk about it. Taiwan might be small, but there's a lot of things that they can do to help as well too. And I want to end this with a short clip, just essentially talking about, how and what Taiwan has been doing to help.
You could pretend like the internet connection is bad. You can avoid any questions about Taiwan.
Tajwan był bezpieczny nawet przed tym kryzysem. Nigdy nie boję się chodzić sama wieczorem.
Тайвань известен как пищевой рай. Единственная опасность, которую я вижу, заключается в том, что я могу набрать вес.
Les Taïwanais sont bien connus pour leur gentillesse, un étranger ne peut donc que se sentir bien accueilli.
Taiwan flew out 84 foreigners stuck in Peru. It has donated 10 million masks. It raised 120 million NT for Italy in 6 days and kept its own number of infected under 400.
Over the years, Taiwan has been ignored and pushed away. But it's okay. We fight, because this is who we are. You can kick us down, and we will get up. We're kind, but we ain't soft. When the world suffers, we help.
Тайвань может помочь.
Tajwan może pomóc.
Taïwan peut vous aider.
Taiwan can help.
So really this is just to talk about, where the kind of understanding about the past of where Taiwan is. How did Taiwan become this sideline country that can't contribute? And at the same time, their own lives are being endangered. There are currently, Taiwan is, still doing a really good job. There's a lot of protocols that's being around, but they're starting to donate. Taiwan, I think right now, has become the world's second largest export of manufacturing of surgical face masks, and they've been donating many of them. Taiwanese people all over the world are also helping them. Just locally, I'm in Boston, for example. Just locally, there's a group of people, group of Taiwanese that I know. They actually manufactured cloth face masks for the police force. 1,000 of them donated to the police force to help them, utilize, their safety measures. So there's a lot that is happening right now. I think there are a lot of, sometimes a lot of anger or emotions that's going around, but I think a lot of times it takes a lot to kind of understand more about the individual information, learn about the background history as to where things come about. So with that, kind of finish the talk today. If there's, I see another, Calvin from California is joining as well too. So open up the floor if there are any questions around. Going to stick around for maybe another 5 minutes or so. If there's no questions, I'm going to close the stream. But if there's any questions, please bring it up. And, again, thank you guys for joining. If there are any other topics that you guys would love to hear about Taiwan, or any questions you guys have, please drop in the comments, so I can take this as an opportunity to figure out what next topics to talk about. Moving forward, we're probably going to do a little bit more. We're going to package some of these live streams into smaller videos so we can talk about, it's easier to consume rather than being like full half an hour. So we have another question here. What is the impact of this epidemic? What is the impact of this epidemic? How it affect Taiwan's relationship towards the world? Fortunately, doesn't seem effective for me for letting the world recognize Taiwan's assistance. So I think one of the things that we really do talk about is that, of Taiwan, we are not, experts in certain fields. We are not historians, not journalists, but we do a lot of research to get a better understanding of these. So some of these analysis questions is coming from a lot of videos and just, my own logical thinking as well too. So the impact of this with Taiwan's relation with the world, really there is, I think this epidemic has kind of shown Taiwan's ability to control it. Taiwan has had SARS back in 2003, 2004, and they've kind of learned a lot of their lessons and their protocols, and they've been showing the world what can be done. There's a lot of people talking about, well, Taiwan, it's an island, it's a very small population, it's not hard. But if you look at a lot of different numbers, there's actually, by ratio, Taiwan is doing very well in terms of the number of cases and even more number of local cases. Take, for example, Korea. South Korea, technically not an island, but I guess kind of North Korea does make it into kind of an island. It has the population close to around Taiwan, but there were a lot of local infections. So this is kind of Taiwan's way of showing how it is and using this opportunity to kind of help other countries as well too. Taiwan has been helping in many capacities, and this epidemic has kind of put Taiwan in the forefront. Different governments, such as the Japanese government has called for Taiwan's entrance in the WHO. There has been there was in Canada, for example, there are people asking Trudeau about what does he say about the support for Taiwan to join WHO, and Trudeau's like, the Canadian government supports Taiwan to join WHO. So this epidemic is kind of showing Taiwan's preparedness, Taiwan's, whether it's technology or even Taiwan's own culture, and how to safeguard it. A lot of people in Taiwan now would say like people in the States, I know that Taiwanese people go like, man, I wish I was still back in Taiwan, because part of it is the people in Taiwan have been very, very cautious about this for a very long time, so that it does create a more safe environment. And whether it's effective or not letting the world recognize Taiwan's assistance, I think Taiwan really, in the end, you can say it's a political game, you can say tactics that's being used and whatnot, but in the end, the Taiwanese government, the Taiwanese people, really, Taiwanese people have been taught to be kind to others and help people in need. Taiwan has always been, this pandemic is not the only time Taiwan has been helping the world. There's been many, many other times, whether it's natural disasters or even, I think at one point, the war on terror. I think ISIS actually posted, all the flags of countries that, that is fighting terrorism and they're going to attack whatever. And, ROC's flag was there to be shown. So even Taiwan's even in the war on terrorism. And, let alone, tsunami and earthquakes in Japan, earthquakes in China, Taiwan has always been there to kind of help out. So effective or not, I don't think it really matters. It really comes down to, this is just, like, as the video is showing, this is really just who Taiwan is and, the people of Taiwan. So I think ultimately it's just hoping that, people can recognize a country that can help others as well, too. And there's another question. If people in Taiwan decide not to have their government be represented as the ROC anymore, would they be able to make a government that is just Taiwan rather than ROC? How possible or likely would this be? So, this is a topic that's been talked a lot about in Taiwan. There is kind of this thing about revolting against the government, saying the ROC, the Republic of China, is hashtag not my government, kind of thing like that. But I think there's something key to understand. As we were saying before, Taiwan as itself is not a government. Taiwan is in itself a geographical location where the government is ROC. Currently, if we want to get into technicalities, what defines a country is, I think 5 criteria, and one of which is the ability to hold diplomatic relations with other countries. Right now, in the world right now, there are only 14 countries that have diplomatic relations with ROC. There are no countries that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. If a Taiwan government, separate from ROC, were to be set up and had diplomatic relations with other countries, then yeah, that completely could be true. But this day and age, as if you ever look up the recognition of states by the United Nations, there has been very, very few in the past, 2-3 decades. And so while anything really is possible, the likelihoods of it, I don't know. I think even in Taiwan, there's 2 major camps in Taiwan, 2 major opposition parties. It's the KMT, which is the Chinese Nationalist Party, which is represented by the ROC, the OG ROC, and the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP. So DPP was grown out of Taiwan, and they usually advocate a little bit more for Taiwanese independence. But there was kind of an identity crisis. They were saying like, well, now that this government now allows for multiple parties, what do we do? So, for example, right now, the ROC president, Tsai Ing-wen, is of the DPP. She is still the ROC president and not just Taiwan president. Granted, nowadays, there's been a lot of changes in terms of writings, in terms of name recognition as to, what is ROC. A lot of times you'll see Republic of China, parentheses, Taiwan. So it gets into semantics, and this definitely goes into the place of international law and just law in general. I can't say to that per se, but I'm sure there's a lot of people, academics around it, and it's always possible. and we'll see how it goes in Taiwan. Another question: does the UN's disposal of ROC tie into other parts of Taiwan exclusion, i.e., recognition in sports, movies? Is there an outside C factor as well? I don't really know what C factor means, but UN's expulsion of the ROC means its lack of recognition in, as we're mentioning, the WHO, for example, the World Health Organization, is underneath the UN, which means Taiwan or ROC is not part of it. This means ICAO, civil aviations, same thing. There are multiple. For example, one of them is International Olympic Committee. This is also why Taiwan can only participate in the Olympics as Chinese Taipei. Fun fact, and kind of tying to the last question, is I forgot which year it was, but there was the Montreal Olympics, and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, proposed that ROC competes underneath the name Taiwan, and it got really awkward because the athletes on transit there, essentially the government was saying like, no, we do not recognize, we can't just take the name Taiwan. We proposed using Republic of China, Taiwan, but IOC didn't want to take it. So then hence Republic of China actually missed out on the Montreal Olympics. And it's very, very awkward. And, nowadays, I think if some people were able to go back in time, I think some people are like, yeah, just let us compete as Taiwan. But now, Olympics, Taiwan competes as Chinese Taipei. One of the things that I kind of thought about but didn't address in the last question, kind of lost my thought. But anyways, one more question. Future video suggestions is great. What is Taiwan's strategy to maintain and further independence? Since a lot of people expect a Sentinel event that will trigger major changes, new president, COVID-19, UN resolution, thus disappointed instead of supporting a more strategic / slow path. I think we're definitely gonna have a talk in the future. One of the big questions everyone asks about is Taiwan a country? Is Taiwan a part of China? Through my 6-7 years of talking to a lot of Taiwanese Americans, a lot of students, and my non-professional, my amateur way of studying of this, there are ways to argue both ways of whether Taiwan's a country or not, whether Taiwan's a part of China or not. But we'll definitely leave that for a future talk as well too. These major events, I think, in the world and in world history, major changes are always triggered by major events. I think things like presidents, I wouldn't even say new York president is really major changes. DPP has been in power, the opposition party to the Nationalist Party, more pro-independence party, has had a president before, and Tsai Ing-wen is in her second term right now. I think these are actually more of a slower path. And even preparedness for things like the COVID-19, creating better infrastructure in terms of, mass manufacturing as technology, and even helping, its 14 diplomatic allies. I think these are all strategies that's been cultivating over time. Things like UN recognition, I think recognition by name only doesn't really matter. I think a large part of what Taiwan needs to do, Taiwan's real strategy really is for all of Taiwan, not just the government, to kind of bolster themselves in their ability and, be a crucial part of the world. Once you're a crucial part, no one else in the world will want you to be taken over. So I think that is something to keep in mind as people talk about what Taiwan's future really is. And I think that is slow. There needs to be attacked from both ways, long-term and short-term solutions. Xi has become more and more aggressive in his campaign of reclaiming, for lack of a better word, Taiwan back to PRC. Even during this pandemic, they conducted their first nighttime military exercise near Taiwan. How likely do you think Xi will succeed in reclaiming Taiwan? Ooh, yeah, this is a doozy one. So, kind of, I think whoever asked this question, I think to kind of help with the reason why we're saying like lack of a better word, the word reclaim doesn't really work because as we're seeing, and I'm just gonna flip through these slides. I'll kind of show. Let me see. This map, for example. So you have to say that the PRC, People's Republic of China, actually never, this gets a really big topic, but PRC, they never had control of Taiwan. So that is probably why the word quote unquote was put for reclaiming, and lack of a better word. So she is trying to reclaim Taiwan. If you're talking about how likely it is, I mean, I grew up in Taiwan, and there was a joke, when I was growing up. It was even saying, if everyone in China just spat on Taiwan, Taiwan would sink. If you're talking about pure military forces, China can knock Taiwan out easily. There's always arguments about, well, U.S. has Taiwan's back because U.S. has the Six Assurances, has the what's that called? Taiwan Relations Act. But all of these are, one, this kind of ties back to a previous question, was this is all with ROC. So first off, you can't claim independence as just Taiwan, not ROC, and expect that treaty to still be enacted. But even then, back in the days, they're talking about the reason why Communist China never took over Taiwan was because they tried many, many times. But at that time, the military was not equipped to take an island like Taiwan. Taiwan is 80% mountainous. It was going to be a very, very hard warfare. However, if you talk about military might, right now, it's definitely possible. And United States, people even though say United States has Taiwan's back, but militarily speaking, this is also from people I've heard about. I think there was a think tank in the United States, caring about China issues. I think Bonnie Glaser, she was saying and Bonnie Glaser and a couple military people, they were saying, because Taiwan is so far and China is so far from the United States, it becomes harder and harder to support. Granted, there are still some bases in Japan, U.S. bases in Japan. If you're talking about military-wise, I think it is highly likely to succeed. But right now, as you know, with a globalized world, the reason why China has so much power right now is because of the globalized world. Everyone depends on China's economy. But at the same time, people are afraid of wars. And so there's really a stalemate. And to put things straight, time is really on Taiwan's side. So it really comes down to just Taiwan taking its time to kind of make itself better so that people would want to support and help Taiwan. All right. So I guess we're kind of nearing the end of this. If there's any more questions, we'll probably leave the stream up for just a little bit more. We'll love to talk to people on the chat if there's any more. Thanks, Frank, for representing Orange County. So thank you guys for joining. Please, if you have a chance, come check out our website, oftaiwan.org, and our Facebook is also, oftaiwan.org. And one last question popped in. Talk about the Taipei Act for a little bit. Taiwanese people have been quite helpful about it. How much do you think it will change things? So the Taipei Act is essentially, I kind of forgot the exact details about it. It's an acronym, very nicely done acronym. But essentially it's talking about how U.S. will support and help Taiwan prevent China from taking over Taiwan. I think one thing to think about all these acts, though, in America is that acts are things that people should do. As we know in America, the U.S. government, if you want to do it, even there's by law, whatever, people will find ways to get around it. I think Taiwanese people are very hopeful. I think there is definitely a growing sense of, not because of necessarily Taiwan's lobbying, granted organizations that's lobbying for Taiwan is very helpful, but at the same time, it really comes with the Taiwanese people, right? This is why it's important to say, for example, this 2020, fill out your U.S. census, write in Taiwanese. People know, just by knowing that there's more Taiwanese in your district, your representatives, whether it's, local representatives or federal representatives, they'll know that there's people that they need to serve. But not just that, this is being more involved, telling people about Taiwan. In the end, the Taiwanese people, even overseas Taiwanese people, there's only so much that you can do. What people need to do is kind of garner the U.S.'s support, not just the government, but even individual people. So I often tell people, I'm like, I love talking about Taiwan. And anyone who knows me knows I love talking about Taiwan. But it really comes down to, individual grassroots movement of people just talking about Taiwan, learning. I think this is part of why we do these live streams, these talks. It's about helping people learn more about Taiwan so they can actually talk about it, even even if you're not Taiwanese, that's fine. If you're Taiwanese, that's great. If you're Taiwanese American, this is really even getting back into your roots and your cultural heritage, and maybe you don't talk it with your family. Overall, acts like Taipei Act, Taiwan Travel Act, these are very good ways opening up avenues, and this raises up the hopes. So with this signed into law now, I think there will be changes, but I don't think it's that as significant. Like, not to belittle it, but I do think there is more support that needs to come from individual people than rather just these big acts. But multiple ways to attack one problem. So this is talking about, as the previous question was talking about, I think over here was kind of like a strategic slow path and a quick acting path. I think that's kind of where it both comes into. So thank you guys for coming. Check out our Facebook. We're going to do more videos around topics like these, about different topics. Message us, email us, message me, leave a comment here. Any topics that you guys want to learn about, keep in touch. Please, like our Facebook so we can, you can kind of keep in note of all the events that's going on. And once again, thank you guys for joining us. I'm Eric Tai of Taiwan, and hope you guys learned a little something today.